The metal was cold against his palm. Freezing, actually, 25 degrees below zero inside the tunnel. But Jean-Michel wasn't thinking about the cold. He was thinking about the rivet he was supposed to install. Install it correctly, and the rocket flies. Install it incorrectly, just slightly off angle, just a fraction of a millimeter wrong, and maybe, just maybe, the rocket fails. Maybe it explodes on the launch pad. Maybe it veers off course and crashes into the North Sea. Maybe it never reaches London at all. His hands trembled. Not from cold, from the weight of an impossible choice. Sabotage meant death. The SS had already hanged 200 men in this factory, their bodies left swinging from cranes as a reminder. But precision meant death too. Death for people he would never meet. People in London who had no idea a French resistance fighter was building the weapon that would kill them. 3 pounds of pressure on the rivet gun. That's all it would take. The guard wasn't watching. No one would know. But Jean-Michel would know, and that's the moment when you discover what you're really made of. Not when you're a hero in your own story, but when you're a ghost in someone else's nightmare, and every choice you make is wrong. This is the story of the V2 rocket. Germany's Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2, the world's first ballistic missile, the ancestor of every rocket that would ever reach space. But it's really about the moment an entire nation convinced itself that the future could be built on corpses, and what it reveals about the gap between technological brilliance and moral bankruptcy, between what we can do and what we should do, between the dream of reaching the stars and the reality of descending into hell. September 1944. 3 locations, connected by a single thread of delusion. In London, Ada Harrison was making tea in her kitchen on Staveley Road, Chiswick, thinking about her grandson's upcoming birthday. In the tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, prisoner 31768, whose name was Yves Béon, but whose identity had been reduced to a number, was assembling fuel pumps for something called an A4 rocket, working 18-hour shifts in conditions that made hell look comfortable. And in a command bunker outside The Hague, SS officers were preparing to launch the first operational V2 at a target 200 miles away, believing they were about to change the course of the war. They were connected by a weapon that would kill more of them than it would kill of their enemies. But nobody knew that yet. Nobody was counting the cost in the right currency. The rocket that would end Ada Harrison's life in approximately 6 hours was the culmination of a dream that started in the imagination of a teenage boy reading science fiction. Werner von Braun, son of Prussian nobility, had become obsessed with the idea of reaching space, not building weapons, reaching space. That distinction would later become important to him. It would become the story he told himself, the story he would repeat for the rest of his life. But here's what actually happened. In 1932, the German army offered to fund his doctorate if he would develop liquid-fueled rockets. In secret, for military purposes. Von Braun said yes. He was 20 years old. He had a choice. He made it. And that choice, like Jean-Michel's rivet, would have consequences that radiated outward like shockwaves. By 1936, the army had moved the rocket program to Peenemünde, a remote facility on the Baltic coast. Huge budgets, state-of-the-art equipment, the best engineers Germany could find. Everything von Braun had ever wanted. All he had to do was build weapons for a regime that was systematically destroying the foundations of civilization. He told himself he was building spaceships. The paperwork said he was building missiles. Both things were true. That's how compromise works. You tell yourself a story about your intentions, and you ignore what you're actually doing. You focus on the elegant mathematics of trajectory calculations, and you don't think about what happens when that trajectory ends in a residential neighborhood. You convince yourself that you're somehow separate from the system you're serving, that you're using them, not the other way around. This is the first lie, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The technical challenges were immense. A rocket that could carry a 1-ton warhead 200 miles. That could reach an altitude of 100 kilometers, touching the edge of space. That could travel faster than sound, making interception impossible. These weren't incremental improvements over existing weapons. This was a leap into a completely new realm of warfare. 46 feet tall, 5 tons of liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel, a thrust of 25 tons, gyroscopic guidance, film cooling for the engine, radio control during the early phase of flight. Every component pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. The engineers at Peenemünde were brilliant, genuinely brilliant. They were solving problems that wouldn't be solved again for decades, and they were doing it for Hitler. October 3rd, 1942. The breakthrough. Test A4 number 4 lifted off perfectly. It climbed to 53 miles. It flew 118 miles downrange. It worked. The engineers celebrated. Walter Dornberger, the military head of the program, declared that they had proven that space travel was possible. Von Braun was thinking about Mars, but Hitler was thinking about London. And here's where the dream began its collision with reality. Because when Hitler saw the films of that successful test flight, he didn't see a vehicle for exploring the cosmos. He saw a weapon that could reach Britain with no possibility of interception, a weapon that could be launched without risking German pilots, a weapon that could deliver vengeance. In German, Vergeltung means retaliation, revenge. The name tells you everything about the psychology driving this program. This wasn't about military strategy. It was about making the enemy suffer, about proving that even as Germany lost the war, it could still hurt its enemies. That's not tactics, that's pathology. Hitler approved mass production. This was January 1943. The same month, the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, the turning point of the war. The moment when anyone with clear eyes could see that Germany was going to lose. But instead of accepting reality, the Nazi leadership doubled down on fantasy. They believed that wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, could somehow reverse the inevitable. One more technical breakthrough, one more superweapon, one more miracle, and they could turn defeat into victory. This is what happens when ideology overrides evidence. When you've built your entire worldview on the premise of superiority, of destiny, of historical inevitability, you can't accept that you're simply losing. You have to believe that salvation is just around the corner. One more weapon, one more battle, one more sacrifice. The V2 program wasn't rational military planning. It was a nation refusing to look at what was actually happening. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems, but one that would define everything that followed. Germany was running out of workers. The Eastern Front had consumed millions. Factories were desperate for labor. And so the Nazi leadership made a decision that turned an engineering program into an atrocity. They would use slaves, concentration camp prisoners, Soviet POWs, forced laborers from occupied territories, human beings who could be worked to death and replaced. This wasn't a reluctant compromise. This was policy, calculated, systematic, efficient in its cruelty. And the engineers who dreamed of space travel would have to build their rockets with the hands of dying men. August 17th, 1943. RAF Bomber Command launched Operation Hydra. Nearly 600 Lancaster and Halifax bombers struck Peenemünde. The stated goal was to destroy the rocket program. The actual result was more complicated. About 750 people died. Most of them were Polish forced laborers sleeping in barracks near the target area. The rocket engineers, living in dispersed housing, mostly survived. The technical facilities were damaged but not destroyed. But the raid accomplished something the British didn't anticipate. It convinced the Nazi leadership to move production underground, to a place where it would be safe from bombing, to a place where the cost in human life would be invisible to everyone except the people dying there, to a place called Dora. The tunnels already existed. A massive underground storage depot carved into the Kohnstein mountain near Nordhausen. 2 main tunnels, each over a mile long, connected by 46 cross tunnels. Perfect for a factory, perfect for hiding production from Allied bombers, perfect for creating hell on earth. The SS took control. General Hans Kammler, the engineer who had designed the crematoria at Auschwitz, was put in charge of construction. The man who had optimized industrial murder would now optimize industrial production. And he brought his methods with him. Efficiency without humanity, productivity without mercy, results without regard for cost, as long as the cost was paid by people who didn't matter. Late August 1943. The first prisoners arrived from Buchenwald concentration camp. They were told they would be working on an important project. They were not told they would be living underground. For 6 months, more than 10,000 prisoners would live in the tunnels, sleep in the tunnels, work in the tunnels, die in the tunnels. No fresh air, no daylight, No sanitation except oil drums cut in half. Water was scarce. Food was starvation rations. The air was thick with rock dust from the excavation, with fumes from the machinery, with the stench of human waste and death. Prisoners worked 18-hour shifts. When one shift was working, the other was sleeping on the stone floor of the tunnel. Then they switched. Work, sleep, until you couldn't work anymore. And then you died. Or you were selected for transport to Bergen-Belsen or Majdanek, which was the same thing, just slower. From October 1943 to March 1944, in just those first 6 months, nearly 3,000 prisoners died in Dora. That's 20 deaths per day, every day, for 6 months. The death rate was higher than almost any other concentration camp in the Nazi system, higher than Auschwitz during the same period, because Auschwitz was designed for murder. Dora was designed for production, but the result was the same. The only difference was that Dora made rockets while it killed people, and those rockets were supposed to save Germany. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, visited the tunnels in December 1943. He saw the corpses littering the work areas. He saw the conditions. Members of his staff were so shocked they had to take extra leave to recover. A week later, Speer wrote to Kammler congratulating him on creating a factory without equal in Europe, unsurpassed even by American standards. He saw the horror. He praised the results. That's not cognitive dissonance, that's choosing to value production over human life. That's deciding that some people are materials, not persons. Speer knew exactly what he was seeing. He just didn't care. By late 1943, production had started. The first rockets rolled off the assembly line, assembled by prisoners who were starving, freezing, dying, assembled by men who spoke a dozen different languages and couldn't communicate except through the universal language of suffering, assembled by people who knew that every rocket they completed successfully brought their own deaths closer, because once you were too weak to work, you were disposable. And here's the terrible mathematics of Dora. If you assembled rockets correctly, you were useful. You might live another month, another week, another day. But those rockets would go on to kill civilians in London and Antwerp. If you sabotaged the rockets, you were killed immediately, hanged in front of the other prisoners as a warning. Over 200 men were publicly executed for sabotage, their bodies left hanging from the tunnel cranes, a reminder that resistance meant death. So what do? You're starving, you're dying, every breath hurts. Your identity has been reduced to a number. Your name doesn't matter, your life doesn't matter. You exist only to produce weapons for people who consider you subhuman. Do you sabotage the rocket and die today? Or do you build it correctly and die next week, knowing that you've contributed to someone else's death? There's no good choice. There's no heroic option. There's only survival, and survival means compromise. This is the moral landscape of Dora. This is what it looks like when human beings are reduced to tools. And the engineers knew. That's important. Because for decades after the war, von Braun and his colleagues would claim they didn't know, that they were isolated at Peenemünde, focused on technical problems, unaware of the conditions at Dora. But the documentary record is clear. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk, the factory inside the tunnels, at least a dozen times. He toured the facility. He met with production managers. He saw the prisoners. In one documented case, he personally requested the transfer of skilled workers from Buchenwald to work on a technical project. He wasn't a passive observer. He was an active participant in a system that was killing thousands of people to build his rockets. Arthur Rudolph, the production manager, was directly responsible for maintaining the pace of assembly. When rockets failed quality inspections, it was Rudolph who had to explain why. And when prisoners were suspected of sabotage, it was Rudolph who reported them to the SS for execution. After the war, Rudolph would emigrate to the United States, become an American citizen, and lead the Saturn V program that put men on the moon. In 1984, facing an investigation by the Department of Justice, he would renounce his citizenship and return to Germany rather than face questions about his role at Dora. Von Braun would die an American hero in 1977. His Nazi passed a footnote in most obituaries. The prisoners who died building his rockets don't have obituaries. Most of them don't even have names in the historical record. They're just numbers, estimated deaths, statistical abstractions. By the end of the war, Approximately 60,000 prisoners had passed through the Mittelbau-Dora camp system. About 20,000 of them died. At least 10,000 of those deaths can be directly attributed to the V2 program. That's twice the number of people killed by V2 strikes on Allied targets. Let that sink in. The V2 was the only weapon system in history that killed more people in its production than in its deployment. More Germans, Poles, French, Russians, and Czechs died building the rocket than British and Belgians died when it exploded. This wasn't a military failure. It was a moral abomination dressed up as an engineering triumph. September 8, 1944. 6:43 p.m. Staveley Road, Chiswick. Ada Harrison was still in her kitchen. The private walking past the school was thinking about his girlfriend, and then, with no warning, the first operational V2 struck. The explosion killed 3 people instantly. Ada Harrison, 3-year-old Rosemary Clark, and sapper Bernard Browning on leave from the Royal Engineers. They heard nothing before impact. The rocket travelled faster than sound. The explosion was the first indication that anything was happening. And then they were dead. For the British government, this was a nightmare. The V1 flying bombs, the buzz bombs, at least you could hear them coming. You could run for shelter. The V1 gave you a chance. The V2 gave you nothing. No warning. No defense. Just sudden, random death from the sky. The government tried to cover it up at first, blaming the explosions on defective gas mains. The public wasn't fooled. They started calling them flying gas pipes, their dark humor a defense against the terror of weapons that couldn't be stopped. Over the next 7 months, 3,225 V2s were launched. About 1,400 hit targets in England, most of them aimed at London. Another 1,600 struck Antwerp, the Belgian port city crucial to Allied supply lines. The deadliest single strike was November 25, 1944. A V2 hit a Woolworths store in New Cross, London, on a Saturday afternoon when it was packed with shoppers. 168 people died. 121 were seriously wounded. One rocket. One moment. And suddenly dozens of families had to figure out how to keep living when the person they loved most had been obliterated while buying Christmas presents. The final V2 to hit Britain struck on March 27, 1945. It killed Ivy Millichamp in her home in Kent. She was 34 years old. She was the last British civilian to die in World War II, the last casualty of Hitler's wonder weapon. The total Allied casualties from V2 strikes are estimated at about 9,000 dead and perhaps 12,000 seriously wounded. Those are real people, real families destroyed, real lives ended. But the vast majority of those casualties were civilians, not soldiers, not military targets, civilians. Because the V2 was too inaccurate to hit anything specific. Its circular error probable, the radius within which half the rockets would land, was measured in miles, not feet. You couldn't aim a V2 at a factory or a military base and expect to hit it. You could only aim it at a city and hope you hit something. The V2 was a terror weapon. Its purpose wasn't to destroy military capability, it was to destroy morale, to make civilians live in constant fear, to make them understand that German vengeance could reach them anywhere. That's not warfare, that's terrorism. And from a purely military standpoint, the V2 program was a catastrophic waste of resources. Each rocket cost 100,000 Reichsmarks to produce, about the same as a high-performance fighter aircraft. Germany manufactured about 6,000 V2s. That's 6,000 fighters that were never built. Fighters that Germany desperately needed as American bombers were systematically destroying German industry. The V2 program consumed a third of Germany's fuel alcohol production, fuel that could have powered trucks and tanks and aircraft. It consumed thousands of tons of scarce materials. It diverted some of the best engineers and technicians from other projects. And for what? To kill 9,000 people at a cost of approximately 30,000 German lives if you count production deaths, combat casualties, and the opportunity cost of not building defensive fighters. Freeman Dyson, who worked on bomber operations research for the RAF during the war, later said that he and his colleagues were grateful to von Braun. Every V2 launched meant one less German fighter in the sky. The Nazi leadership believed they were deploying a game-changing superweapon. They were actually choosing defeat. But the psychology behind this delusion is important, because it wasn't just about the V2. It was about the entire Nazi worldview collapsing under the weight of reality, and the leadership's absolute refusal to acknowledge what was happening. Think about the ideological foundation of Nazi Germany. They believed in German superiority, not just cultural or political superiority, but fundamental biological, racial superiority. They believed they were destined to dominate Europe, to create a 1,000-year Reich, to establish a new order built on strength and racial purity. They had been taught this, they had internalized it, they had built their entire identity around it, and now they were losing, not to superior tactics or strategy, but to countries they had been taught to despise. Britain, which they considered decadent and weak. America, which they called a mongrel nation of immigrants and minorities. The Soviet Union, which they had expected to collapse within weeks. These inferior nations were beating them, and that was psychologically unbearable, so they turned to wonder weapons, to the idea that German technical genius could still prevail. That one more invention, one more breakthrough could somehow reverse the verdict that was already clear to anyone paying attention. The V2 wasn't just a weapon, it was a psychological crutch, a way to avoid facing the truth, and the people most invested in this delusion were the ones making the decisions. Hitler himself was obsessed with wonder weapons. He demanded reports on new technologies. He pinned his hopes on jet fighters, on acoustic torpedoes, on nerve gas, on atomic bombs. Anything that would change the equation, anything that would validate his belief that Germany was destined to win. Because if Germany lost, that meant the entire Nazi ideology was wrong. It meant the sacrifices had been for nothing. It meant millions had died for a lie. You can't accept that and keep functioning. So you convince yourself that victory is still possible. You just need one more miracle. The generals who should have known better, who understood the strategic situation, played along. Partly because dissent meant death, but partly because they wanted to believe too. They needed to believe. Because the alternative was admitting they had led their nation into a catastrophe, that they had participated in crimes that would haunt them forever, that they had destroyed Germany in the name of making it great, so they focused on the rockets, on the impressive technical specifications, on the supersonic speed and the inability to intercept. They convinced themselves that terror bombing could break British morale, even though German morale hadn't broken under far heavier British and American bombing. They convinced themselves that one more month, one more weapon, would make the difference. This is what happens when you prioritize belief over evidence, when you can't admit you were wrong because your identity depends on being right. When you've gone so far down the path that turning back would mean confronting everything you've done. March 17, 1945. 11 V-2 rockets were launched at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. American forces had captured this Rhine crossing intact, and Hitler was desperate to destroy it. This was the only time V-2s were aimed at a tactical military target. The bridge was about 60 feet wide. The nearest rocket landed 270 meters away. One rocket hit Cologne, 40 miles in the wrong direction. This was the weapon Germany had spent billions of Reichsmarks to develop. This was the wonder weapon that was supposed to change the war. And it couldn't hit a bridge. By April 1945, the Allies were closing in on the tunnel complex at Dora. The SS began evacuating prisoners. Most were forced onto death marches. Thousands died on these marches, shot by guards or simply collapsing from starvation and disease. Some were packed into trains, into boxcars, without food or water. When these trains arrived at other camps, many of the prisoners inside were already dead. On April 11th, American troops liberated what was left of Dora. They found hundreds of dying prisoners abandoned in barracks. They found 1,300 corpses. The soldiers who entered the camp were hardened combat veterans. They had fought across Europe. But nothing had prepared them for this. The smell. The skeletal figures barely alive. The evidence of systematic cruelty. War correspondents documented what they found. The photographs and films from Dora became some of the first widely distributed evidence of Nazi atrocities. The American public saw these images. They saw the tunnels where the rockets had been built. They saw the crematoria. They saw the price that had been paid for Germany's wonder weapon. But here's where the story takes a turn that makes it even more complicated, because the Americans wanted the rockets. They wanted the engineers. They wanted the technology. The war in Europe was over, but the war with Japan was still ongoing. and already the Cold War with the Soviet Union was becoming visible on the horizon. Whoever controlled rocket technology would have a massive strategic advantage. So the US military launched Operation Paperclip, a program to recruit German scientists and engineers to bring them to America, to put them to work for the United States. Von Braun and his team surrendered to American forces in May 1945. They had fled south as the Soviet army approached Peenemünde. They had carefully hidden documents and components. They knew their knowledge was valuable. They knew both sides would want them. Von Braun later described this as a careful calculation. He believed the Americans would actually use their rockets for space exploration. He believed he could finally fulfill his childhood dream. And he was probably right. But it's also true that he was choosing the side that wouldn't hold him accountable for Dora. Over the next year, hundreds of German rocket scientists and engineers were brought to the United States. Their Nazi Party membership was overlooked. Their SS ranks were erased from records. Their involvement in slave labor was buried. They were given security clearances. They were given positions in the US military's missile program. They became American citizens. They became heroes. Von Braun became the public face of the American space program. He appeared on television. He worked with Walt Disney to promote space exploration. He designed the Saturn V rocket that would take Apollo astronauts to the moon. He became everything he had always wanted to be. And the prisoners who died building his V-2 rockets were forgotten. Not deliberately, not at first, but gradually, through the simple passage of time and the convenience of not asking uncomfortable questions. The narrative that emerged was clean and simple. German rocket scientists helped America win the space race. That's the story. That's what people wanted to believe. The other story, the one about Dora, was complicated and disturbing, and it interfered with the triumphant narrative of American technological achievement. So it was set aside. But some people didn't forget. Survivors of Dora tried to tell their stories. Historians began researching the camp. In the 1980s, investigators started asking questions about the German scientists working for NASA, about their backgrounds, about their knowledge of what happened in the tunnels. Arthur Rudolph, who had been the production manager at Mittelwerk, was forced to leave the country in 1984 rather than face prosecution. He returned to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death, never charged because of statutes of limitations. Von Braun had died in 1977, still celebrated as a space pioneer. After his death, as more information about Dora emerged, his legacy became more controversial, but not controversial enough to erase his name from history. Not controversial enough to change the fundamental story Americans told themselves about the space program. And this is where we need to pause and think about what this story actually means, because the easy response is to divide people into heroes and villains, to say Von Braun was evil or to say he was a victim of circumstances. But both of those answers are too simple. Von Braun was a human being who wanted something desperately, who was given the opportunity to pursue his dream, and who accepted that opportunity without fully reckoning with the cost. Or maybe he did reckon with it, and decided the cost was worth paying. We can't know what was in his mind. What we know is what he did. He joined the Nazi Party. He became an SS officer. He led the development of a weapon designed to kill civilians. He worked within a system that used slave labor. He visited the tunnels where prisoners were dying. He saw the conditions. He continued working. He continued pushing the program forward. He was brilliant. He was ambitious. He was charming. He was complicit. All of these things can be true at the same time. Human beings are not simple. Moral choices are not clean. And the gap between what we tell ourselves about our motivations and what we actually do can be vast. The prisoners at Dora were in an even more impossible situation. They were victims, clearly, but they were also, in some cases, the people who built the weapons that killed civilians in London. They didn't choose to be there. They didn't choose to work on rockets. They were slaves forced to work under threat of death, but their hands still assembled the components. Their labor still contributed to the deaths of people they never met. How do you reconcile that? How do you live with having been forced to participate in atrocity? Some of the survivors spoke about this, about the guilt they carried, not for being at Dora, which wasn't their choice, but for surviving when so many others didn't, for the impossibility of their moral position. for the fact that every day they stayed alive was a day they contributed to a system of horror. This is what it looks like when human beings are put in situations where all choices are bad choices, where survival itself becomes a form of compromise. The guards at Dora were human beings too. Some of them were sadistic. Some of them were just following orders, that pathetic phrase that has never excused anything. Some of them probably convinced themselves that the prisoners were criminals, that they deserved their fate, that they were somehow less than human. Some of them probably hated what they were doing but were too afraid to object. All of them participated. All of them share responsibility. But they're not identical. There are gradations of guilt, there are degrees of complicity, and trying to figure out exactly where each person falls on that spectrum is the work of historians and judges and ultimately ourselves. The Allied civilians who died under V2 strikes were victims in the clearest sense. They weren't combatants. They weren't making strategic decisions. They were just living their lives. And then they weren't. Ada Harrison making tea. Rosemary Clark, 3 years old, who never had a chance to become anything. The shoppers at Woolworths on a Saturday afternoon. Their deaths weren't military necessities. They weren't unfortunate collateral damage in pursuit of legitimate targets. They were the intended result of a weapon designed to kill civilians. That's murder. On a large scale, organized by a state, but still murder, and the fact that it was less effective than German leadership hoped doesn't make it less evil. It just makes it wasteful as well as evil. What does this tell us about technology and morality? About the relationship between scientific progress and human values? The V2 was, objectively, a remarkable achievement. It was the first object humans built that reached space. It pioneered technologies that would later take us to the moon, that would enable satellite communications and GPS and weather forecasting and all the benefits of the space age. The engineering was brilliant. The mathematics were elegant. The achievement was real. And it was built on corpses. It was designed to kill civilians. It was produced by slaves. And after the war, the people who built it told themselves a story where they were heroes of science, where their work was separate from the atrocities, where they were somehow innocent because they were just engineers following their passion. This is the lie we tell ourselves about technology, that it's neutral, that science is separate from morality, that you can work on a project without being responsible for how it's used, but you can't. Every technical decision is a moral decision. Every project exists in a political context. Every engineer is making choices about what to build and who to build it for, and what purposes it will serve. Von Braun chose to build weapons for Hitler. He could have refused. Yes, it might have been dangerous. Yes, he might have lost his funding. Yes, his dreams might have been delayed. But other people in Nazi Germany did refuse. Other scientists declined to work on weapons projects. They paid prices for that refusal, sometimes severe prices. But they made different choices. Von Braun's choice wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. And he lived with the consequences of that choice, or rather, other people died because of that choice, and he lived with a successful career. Think about the allocations of resources. Germany spent as much on the V2 program as America spent on the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb. But the atomic bomb actually ended the war. The V2 did nothing except kill civilians and waste resources. If Germany had built 6,000 more fighters, instead of 6,000 rockets, would it have changed the outcome? No. Germany was going to lose. The strategic situation was hopeless by 1943, but it might have prolonged the war. It might have increased Allied casualties. It might have cost more lives in the end. Or maybe those fighters would have been shot down just like the ones Germany actually built. The point is, from a military standpoint, the V2 was a terrible investment. It cost more than it was worth. It diverted resources from programs that might have actually mattered. It was a weapon built on ideology rather than strategy, on the need to believe in German superiority rather than on rational calculation of military utility. And that ideology cost 30,000 lives, mostly German lives, mostly the lives of prisoners who were considered expendable. What does this tell us about the relationship between belief and reality? About what happens when you can't admit you're wrong? About the danger of investing your identity in ideas that can't survive contact with evidence. Nazi ideology depended on German superiority. When German forces started losing, the ideology didn't adapt. It couldn't adapt. Because admitting that Germany might not be superior, that the Aryan race might not be destined to rule, that the entire foundation of Nazi belief might be built on delusion, would mean that everything they had done was for nothing. That the invasions, the occupations, the murders, the Holocaust, all of it was based on a lie. That's psychologically unbearable. So instead, they doubled down. They invested in wonder weapons. They convinced themselves that one more technological breakthrough would validate their beliefs. They confused the ability to build impressive technology with the righteousness of their cause. And they destroyed themselves in the process. This isn't unique to Nazi Germany. This is a human failing. We all do this on smaller scales. We believe something. We invest in that belief. We build our identity around it. And when evidence contradicts it, we don't abandon the belief. We attack the evidence. We find reasons to dismiss it. We look for alternative explanations. We convince ourselves that we're right and the world is wrong, because admitting we were wrong means confronting all the choices we made based on that wrong belief. It means accepting that we wasted time, effort, resources on something that wasn't true. And that's painful, so we avoid it. We double down. We invest more heavily in the belief that's failing. The V2 program is what that looks like at the scale of nations. And the result was catastrophic. Now think about Jean Michel again, the French resistance fighter in the tunnel, holding the rivet gun, making an impossible choice. After the war, if he survived, how did he live with what he had done? How did he reconcile building weapons that killed civilians with his resistance to Nazi occupation? How did he explain to himself that he assembled rockets correctly because sabotage meant death and his survival mattered more than the lives of strangers in London? Or maybe he did sabotage them subtly, in ways that wouldn't be obvious, accepting the risk that he would be caught and hanged. We don't know. We don't have his story in the historical record. We just have the aggregate numbers. 20,000 dead at Dora, 9,000 killed by V2 strikes. We have the statistics. We don't have the internal struggles. We don't have the moment-by-moment moral calculations. We don't have the dreams and nightmares. All we have are the results. And the results tell us that the V2 program destroyed more of the people who built it than the people it was aimed at. That's the headline. That's the fact that summarizes everything. But underneath that fact are thousands of individual stories. Thousands of moments like Jean Michel's moment with the rivet gun. Thousands of choices made under impossible circumstances. Thousands of people trying to survive in a system designed to destroy them. And we need to remember that even as we judge the people who designed and managed that system, the people who chose to participate, the people who told themselves they were just engineers pursuing knowledge, the people who valued their dreams more than the lives being destroyed to achieve those dreams. The V2 didn't win the war for Germany. It didn't even change the war. What it did was demonstrate that humans could build machines capable of reaching space. And after the war, that's what mattered to the people who wanted to use that technology. They didn't care about Dora. They didn't want to think about the slaves who died in the tunnels. They wanted to think about the moon, about Mars, about the future, about progress. And so they hired von Braun. They brought him to America. They gave him resources and respect and the opportunity to finally build the rockets he had always dreamed about. Rockets that wouldn't carry warheads. Rockets that would carry instruments and satellites and eventually people. And he did it. He built the Saturn V. He put Americans on the moon. He achieved his dream. And the people who died at Dora were forgotten. Not completely, not permanently, but forgotten enough that it didn't stop his career. Forgotten enough that when most Americans thought about von Braun, they thought about the space program, not about the concentration camp. That's the story we wanted to tell. The triumphant story of technological achievement. The inspiring story of reaching beyond Earth. We didn't want the complicated story. The story where the same man who designed the rocket that took us to the moon also designed the rocket that was built by slaves and aimed at civilians. We wanted heroes and villains. We wanted clean narratives. But history isn't clean. People aren't simple. And the technologies that shape our world are built by people carrying all their contradictions and compromises and choices. The V2 became the ancestor of every rocket that followed. The R-7 that launched Sputnik. The Atlas and Titan missiles that formed America's early space program. the Saturn V, the space shuttle. Everything we've done in space rests on the foundation built at Peenemünde and in the tunnels of Dora. Every satellite that improves your GPS navigation. Every weather forecast that saves lives by predicting hurricanes. Every communication satellite that connects the world. Every scientific instrument that helps us understand the universe. All of it, in some way, descends from the V2. And all of it carries that origin story, that complication, that moral stain. We can't undo it. We can't separate the technology from its history. We can't take the rockets to space without acknowledging where they came from. What we can do is remember. We can tell the complete story. We can refuse to let the triumphant narrative erase the suffering that made it possible. We can look at von Braun and see both the brilliant engineer and the complicit participant in atrocity. We can appreciate the achievement of reaching space while remembering the cost of getting there. We can hold multiple truths in mind at once, even when they're uncomfortable, especially when they're uncomfortable. This is what the V2 story teaches us, if we're willing to learn. That technological achievement doesn't excuse moral failure. That brilliance and cruelty can coexist in the same person, in the same project. That the price of progress is sometimes paid by people who never agreed to pay it. That ideology can blind us to reality until the gap between belief and evidence becomes catastrophic. That choices have consequences that radiate outward in ways we can't always predict or control. That surviving impossible situations sometimes requires impossible compromises. That we need to remember the people who died even when it's more convenient to forget them. That the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're doing can diverge wildly from what we're actually accomplishing. That ambition without moral boundaries can lead anywhere. That wonder weapons are still weapons. That vengeance is not strategy. That you can win the technical challenge and lose your humanity in the process. That the gap between intention and impact can be measured in corpses. In the end, Ada Harrison died in her kitchen on Staveley Road, killed by a weapon built by slaves, designed by dreamers who made terrible choices, deployed by a regime that preferred fantasy to reality. She died because technology advanced faster than wisdom, because someone could build a rocket before they considered whether they should, because the dream of reaching space became entangled with the nightmare of totalitarianism, because individual ambition found common cause with collective evil, because when you're focused on solving the technical problem, it's easy to ignore what the solution will be used for, because the people making the choices weren't the people paying the price. And that ultimately is what we need to remember, not just about the V2, not just about World War II, but about every technology we build, every project we undertake, every dream we pursue. Who pays the price? Who benefits? What compromises are we making? What are we choosing not to see? What stories are we telling ourselves to avoid facing what we're actually doing? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary questions, because the alternative is to build more weapons on corpses and call it progress, to sacrifice more people to our dreams and call it destiny, to mistake technical capability for moral justification, to repeat the same pattern, to learn nothing. The V2 was supposed to be Germany's salvation. Instead, it became its epitaph, a monument to brilliant engineering in service of a bankrupt ideology, a wonder weapon that destroyed its creators, a rocket that pointed toward the stars while standing on a foundation of bones.